If women remained forever burdened by incessant childbirths and frequent miscarriages, they would hardly be able to exercise the political rights that they might win. I used to think that the reason we fought for reproductive rights was for choice. And I mean, we do, but I think that my perception of choice has always been very heavily influenced by my racial privilege as a white woman. While women of color are urged at every turn to become permanently infertile, white women enjoying prosperous economic conditions are urged by the same forces to reproduce themselves. How is it that the same oppressive forces that try to persuade or force reproduction onto me also try to dissuade or take away the right to reproduction for women of color? And if I, someone who wants to practice medicine someday and who has an interest in addressing equity issues in healthcare, wasn't aware of this, how many other people are unaware? What does healthcare equity even look like? Is it possible? What frameworks do we even have to address reproductive oppression and the issues that it presents to healthcare? Before we can really substantially answer these questions, we really need to understand the context. We need to know the history and how we've gotten to where we are today and what the current landscape is for these issues. Most importantly, I think that we need to decenter the privileged experience and recenter the marginalized experience. Audre Lorde is one of my absolute role models and a really important thought leader. She has this quote, and I feel like it really speaks to what I would consider to be the heart of this documentary and really what I'm hoping to do with this film. She said, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." Even when her shackles are very different. Recently, Idaho's Governor Brad Little signed a bill into law taking effect immediately that gives healthcare providers and entities the right to deny patients non-emergency procedures that would violate their, quote, sincerely held religious or moral beliefs. The bill states, healthcare providers shall have the right of conscience and, pursuant to that right, shall not be required to participate in or pay for a medical procedure, treatment, or service that violates such healthcare provider's conscience.
I had not heard about this specific case, but it definitely comes up periodically on the issue of reproductive health, but sometimes on other issues too. Medical assisted treatment for opioid use disorder comes up where I've run into pharmacists who aren't comfortable dispensing the medications that I've provided in the way I have instructed the patient to take them. I think it is dangerous. When people can individually do that based on their own conscience, then we lose our Hippocratic oath to do the best, to do no harm, and to practice evidence-based medicine. We never want people really to do things that they don't feel good about, but we also know when we go into this practice what will be asked of us. I have OBGYN colleagues who are in this area of specialty who don't prescribe birth control. They just will talk about natural family planning. A patient might need a D&C, a procedure after, when they're in the midst of losing a pregnancy. So it's not technically an abortion, but they feel uncomfortable providing that care. Some of these providers won't do a tubal ligation after pregnancy. For a very long time, I was practicing at one of the Catholic hospitals here. Our patients would have to undergo a trip down to Eau Claire. So let's say they had labor and delivery. It was either a planned C-section or an urgent or emergent C-section. They're in the operating room. They're open, the tubes are there, and they have to get closed up and sent the next day to another hospital that's not a Catholic hospital to have their tubal ligation.
Hearing about the law passing in Idaho, that was the first time that I had heard of that happening in healthcare. It's really interesting to hear that it happens anyway, even without.
Kind of does.
The progressive potential of the birth control movement was indisputable, but it really fell short in addressing challenges to racism and class exploitation. Reproductive rights were advocated for at the same time that women's political equality was being fought for. And similarly, women's new dreams about pursuing careers and aspirations outside of marriage and motherhood could only really be realized if they could limit and plan their pregnancies. And so voluntary motherhood became the slogan or the face of the birth control movement. But this vision of voluntary motherhood was really bound to a lifestyle enjoyed predominantly by the middle class, and it didn't reflect the conditions of working class women. And so as a consequence, many poor and working class women had a difficult time identifying with a movement that didn't represent their reality or their interests. The most important victory of the birth control movement was in Roe versus Wade, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a woman's right to personal privacy implied her right to decide whether to have an abortion. However, the court's decision reflected the narrowness of the mainstream women's movement, which viewed abortion as the singular way to measure women's right to control their reproductive lives. The justices explicitly disagreed with the appellant's claim that the women's right is absolute, and she is entitled to terminate her pregnancy at whatever time, in whatever way, and for whatever reason she alone chooses. There's nothing in the 21-page decision about the equality of women and the ways that forced pregnancy actually impairs that manifestation. The Supreme Court claimed to want to make a dispassionate decision that was not influenced by the larger debates concerning abortion. In reality, the broad range of factors constraining women's equality was ignored because doing otherwise would open larger and more complicated issues involving pay, family structure, and social provision. It would also require accounting for how women's equality had different meanings for women who were not white or middle class. This neglect really opened the door for the passing of the Hyde Amendment just 7 years later in 1977, which effectively defunded abortions for Black, Puerto Rican, Chicana, Native American, Indian women, and impoverished white women. Surgical sterilizations, on the other hand, were funded by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, meaning they remained free on demand. If ever women would enjoy the right to plan their pregnancies, legal and easily accessible birth control measures and abortions would have to be complemented by an end to sterilization. In 1905, Theodore Roosevelt gave a proclamation that, quote, race purity must be maintained. And by 1906, he equated the falling birth rate amongst white women with race suicide. And this controversy brought forward issues that most separated feminists from the working class and the poor. They emphasized birth control as a route to careers and higher education, even though this was something outside of the reach for poor women with or without birth control. And they began to popularize the ideology that poor people had a moral obligation to restrict the size of their families because large families drain taxes and charity expenditures of the wealthy. So the birth control movement inevitably fell to eugenic ideologies, invoking birth control to preventing the proliferation of the lower class and sort of as an antidote to race suicide. In the summer of 1973, the Ralph sisters case came out. Two sisters, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice, had surgeries that were ordered by the Hugh-funded Montgomery Community Action Committee. That case really opened the door to even more cases, and the reality of sterilization abuse became more publicly known. And so one of these cases was that of Niall Ruth Cox, who was an 18-year-old woman in North Carolina. And officials had threatened to discontinue her family's welfare payments if she refused to submit to surgical sterilization. Shortly after that, 18 women from Aiken, South Carolina, brought to court that they had been sterilized by Dr. Clovis Pierce, the sole obstetrician in town. According to nurses in his office, Dr. Pierce insisted that pregnant welfare women, quote, will have to submit to voluntary sterilization if they wanted him to deliver their babies. He claimed to be, quote, tired of people running around and having babies and having to pay for them with my taxes. He was supported by the South Carolina Medical Association. Their members declared that doctors, quote, have a moral and legal right to insist on sterilization permission before accepting a patient if it's done on the initial visit.
There's this interactive map from gutmatcher.org, and it basically tells you about the abortion policies and access to abortion. It's disappointing to see how many restrictions there are and to see the ways that those restrictions are not just broadly restrictive, but they're strategically restrictive.
So our clinic is completely charity funded and grant funded. So we apply for grants, and sometimes we can get like vouchers for community transportation and things like that, but that is still pretty limited. Thinking of, a very specific example where a woman who is, I think, probably I'm going to say mid-30s, late 30s. I was seeing her actually for medication-assisted treatment of opioid use disorder. She found herself pregnant again. She already had 4 or 5 non-custodial children, so children that did not live with her. And she found herself with an unwanted pregnancy and was trying to access abortion care. And I thought I would be able to talk to her about it and kind of make it happen. A couple of barriers. One, to getting a procedural abortion. She was on Badger Care, and the closest place that we could send her to was Milwaukee, which was not feasible. She already had a lot of barriers because she was actively using substances, unemployed, and had an unstable living situation. I thought, okay, she's in the window, we could use a medical abortion, and I thought I could do that. Figured out what I needed to prescribe, and then found out I can't prescribe that because of the laws in Wisconsin. And then she was trying to access getting these online. And there are services that do that also, but for a cost, and she can't afford that. And then when it just kind of got later in the pregnancy and termination was off the table, then it was hard to get her prenatal care because of her fear of legal repercussions for herself. There's just so many situations where trying to make that choice in that time frame doesn't work, and there's a lot of push to try and move it back, as they have in other places, to 6 or 8 weeks. Not feasible for women to always know they're pregnant and to be able to make the choice in that time frame.
The reproductive justice framework analyzes how the ability of any woman to determine her own reproductive destiny is linked directly to the conditions in her community. It addresses the social reality of inequality, moving beyond a demand for privacy and respect for individual decision-making to then include social support that is necessary. Reproductive oppression is, by definition, the control and exploitation of women, girls, and individuals through our bodies, sexuality, labor, and reproduction. Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective is developing a more inclusive vision for building a new movement, one that isn't narrowly focused on protecting the legal right to abortion, but rather a multi-pronged approach that uses 3 key frameworks. Reproductive health deals with service delivery. Reproductive rights addresses legal issues, and reproductive justice focuses on movement building. All 3 frameworks work together to provide a comprehensive solution to reproductive oppression. Crucially, the reproductive justice framework doesn't focus on the means, which is a polarizable debate on abortion and birth control, but instead it focuses on the ends: better lives for women, healthier families, and sustainable communities. Reproductive justice can be used as a theory to start connecting the dots in our own lives, a strategy for bringing together social justice movements, but also as a practice of analyzing our lives through the art of telling our stories. According to Ricky Solinger, there are some conditions of reproductive justice. It encompasses women's right to manage their reproductive capacity, right to choice, preventative care, accurate information.
One resource in this day and age is just having access to high quality, high speed internet. Not everyone has that. I'm seeing that most people who come in do have a phone, but a lot of those are kind of the pay as you go. They don't want to use their minutes up, which is actually a problem when we try to reach them. They're trying to limit their minutes so they don't always answer the phone. Language is an issue for some of our patients, not universally so, but I would say the health literacy around reproductive health is not very good in the entire population, not just the folks that come to see us at the Open Door Clinic. I'd rather err on the side of giving them oversimplified information and details than assuming they understand things the way that I do.
It includes the right to safe and affordable services like contraceptives, abortion, and reproductive technology.
You know, in the Open Door Clinic, obviously, what we can provide there, that is a big barrier. Things that we can address, we can get a urine pregnancy test. I can send blood or urine for like STD screening, things like that. We can do a gynecologic exam. It's not set up very nicely for that. The space that we are given, because it's completely donated space, is pretty tight and not as private as we'd like it to be in our little cubbies. You know, there's a curtain so people could in theory walk in, but we can do it. So we don't provide like screening tests like pap smears and things like that. We send patients to public health for cervical cancer screening stuff.
Reproductive justice also encompasses women's right and access to safe, respectful, and affordable medical care during and after pregnancy. It includes the right of incarcerated women to safe and respectful care during and after pregnancy, including the right to give birth in a safe, respectful, and medically appropriate environment. Reproductive justice also encompasses a woman's right to be the parent of her child, which includes the right to economic resources to be a parent, the right to education and training, to decide whether or not to be the parent of the child one gives birth to leave from work, to care for newborns and others in need of care, and the right to high-quality child care. We also need to ensure the right of women to physical safety and to parent in a physically and environmentally safe context. The right to be the parent of her child. Is that upheld when millions of Indigenous mothers lose their daughters, and daughters lose their mothers, and communities lose their women and girls? When Mao Lee interviewed and shadowed Hmong women in Thailand, They casually shared horror stories and first-hand experiences involving mysterious figures, ghosts, haunting, and supernatural events. And while observing a group of Hmong women in a rural village in Thailand, she was asked, "Do you know Paj?" The story about Paj is an example of what Mao Li calls trans-border love, a relationship that is personally and profoundly tied to a loved one across time and space by virtue of shared lived experiences. What's also embedded in Paj's story is violence, displacement, and capitalism. Being displaced and being extracted from resources prevented her parents from saving her.
For reproductive health care to be truly equitable for all people, the unique factors associated with gender and sexuality must be more heavily considered. That was the thesis. I only scratched the surface on unpacking some of the symptoms of an inequitable system and its impacts on reproductive justice. I think if there's anything to take away from this, it's these key points.
Just let